The preceding program was brought to you in part by the Cuckoo's Nest, which is located in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. Welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. I'm Pete Mezzetti. My guest this evening is Betsy Gara, who is the Executive Director of COST. Welcome. How are you? Good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Pete. Great to be down the shoreline.
Thanks for coming down. What's new?
Well, we have about 6 more weeks of the legislative session. They adjourn on June 4th.
Right.
So we spend pretty much all of our time either at the state capitol or on Zoom at public hearings and other committee meetings, trying to figure out what's happening with different pieces of legislation.
So I understand from doing some research for tonight's show that you guys are celebrating your 50th anniversary at COST.
We are. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary as the voice of Connecticut's small towns. So we had a big annual meeting and we made sure that we highlighted that anniversary in our logo and other informational pieces. So it's great. We started out very small and now we've grown to 115 members throughout the state of Connecticut.
Wow. Now, what exactly is COST and what do you guys do?
So COST is the Connecticut Council of Small Towns. We're an advocacy group. So we represent small towns, provide them with a strong voice in the legislative process, and also with state agencies on regulatory matters, on other public policies.
Okay. Now, as far as the state budget goes, what is the impact on municipal aid?
So at this point, the governor has proposed a budget, and that came out in early February. We have some concerns with the governor's proposed budget. It eliminates, for example, the hold harmless agreement under the education cost sharing formula, the ECS grant. And that's the biggest piece of municipal aid that many of our small towns get. The hold harmless provision was enacted to make sure that towns wouldn't lose funding as they implement some changes to the formula. And so by eliminating that, unfortunately, 81 municipalities are going to lose education funding. And that's a big hit right now because towns are faced with rising inflation, but also increasing personnel costs. So teacher salaries, paraeducator salaries, and also healthcare costs are just going through the roof. And so towns are really struggling to develop local budgets that meet their obligation to fund education without significantly increasing property taxes. And it's really hard. And unfortunately, the levels of funding aren't sufficient. The ECS grant, for example, has not kept pace with inflation. We do appreciate that they've increased funding over time, but it's still not enough, and it's still not enough to ensure that property taxpayers don't bear the burden for funding education costs. At the same time, special education costs are also increasing every year. Connecticut, for example, has a lot of out-of-school district and out-of-state placements for special education, more than any other state in the country, and that's got to change. So we need to do more with providing special education students with services in district or on a regional basis. Governor Lamont's budget does do that, so we're supportive of that. And it did add additional special education funding, but only in fiscal year 27. As a result, the legislature actually convened in special session to provide towns with some additional funding because they recognize that the amount that they authorized under last year's budget fell short. So it's a lot of big changes there. So now the Appropriations Committee has to put its stamp on the budget. They are required to do that by the end of next week. We expect that they're going to do that on Tuesday. And so we're hoping that they restore some of the municipal aid that would be cut under the governor's budget, and that they also provide some funding for things like early voting and increased transportation costs and things like that. So we're hopeful, and the Appropriations Committee actually has a really good track record of recognizing that we have to maintain municipal aid, otherwise we're just shifting a burden onto our property taxpayers.
Now, can you explain what the ECS grant is?
Sure. Well, the ECS, so it's the Education Cost Sharing Grant.
Okay.
And it's based on a formula, and I won't get into the mechanics of the formula, but it's based on things like a town's wealth,
Okay.
its property values, the number of students in the district, the number of special needs students, number of English as second learner numbers, and things of that nature. So it's a pretty complex formula.
Okay.
And over time it hadn't been changed. So back in 2017 they made a lot of changes to the ECS formula to make sure that towns were receiving a fair amount of funding.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there are always winners and losers when you do that, and a lot of towns ended up losing money. And so they passed the Hold Harmless Act provisions to make sure that those towns would remain whole. But again, at this point, because of inflation, because of increasing costs, every town needs more funding in order to provide the educational services that our students need.
Now, is there a difference in educational funding if you're in a big city rather than a small town, or is it pretty much all the same?
Well, there's a lot of differences because of the way that the ECS formula is structured. So poorer districts certainly receive a greater percentage of ECS funding, and that makes sense. We understand that. But we think everyone should have some level of fair share funding, again, so that it's not the property taxpayers bearing the brunt for picking up education costs. The state has the obligation to provide education, and so they need to make sure that they're meeting that obligation. And I think that legislators have recognized that, and that's the good news. But we were far away from fully funding education, and we're getting closer, but we need to do more.
What more do you think they need to do?
Keep pace with inflation is the big thing, and also give towns some more flexibility. So even in towns where they have lost population, where they maybe have closed a school, it's difficult to rein in the education budget because of what they call this minimum budget requirement. And that MBR requires towns to pay the same amount for education in their budget that they did in the previous year. So they can't make any cuts except under certain circumstances. So there's some wiggle room if you close a school, but certainly not enough to, there needs to be more flexibility than there currently is in that.
And you think that could change?
It's changed over the years. There's nothing under consideration this session, so no. But we have towns that are really struggling. We're seeing education budgets come in with 5-6% increases. So it's going to be interesting to see how those play out at referendum.
Right.
And at the same time, towns are penalized if they increase their budgets by more than 2.5%. And so this year, the legislature actually passed a bill last week that provides that penalty provision is not going to be in effect for this fiscal year because they recognize that the budgets are just going up and up. So they don't want to penalize the towns as a result of that. Things beyond their control.
Right. Now, I didn't realize that the towns are penalized.
They're penalized by a grant that they receive, a municipal revenue sharing grant,
Oh, okay.
is actually reduced by 50 cents on the dollar
All right.
if they exceed a 2.5% increase in their local budget.
Ooh,
So, but some of those things are beyond their control.
right, yeah.
In addition, if you're looking at school construction costs, many of our smaller towns, certainly the wealthier smaller towns, don't receive as much in school construction, whereas the larger cities and the poorer districts receive a significant amount of school construction dollars. So again, it makes sense, but we need to make sure that all towns are receiving a fair share of amount of funding to meet their obligations.
Now, how closely does your organization work with the governor's office and the legislature?
We work closely with the governor's office. Governor Lamont keynoted our annual meeting, and
Oh,
we're
did he?
always happy to have him, yeah. And so we meet with the office to discuss our proposals in the beginning of the session.
Okay.
We meet with the Office of Policy and Management, and at this point, we're going to be circling back and trying to see where things are in terms of other legislative priorities. There's a lot out there. I mean, for those of you that are watching the program, you really need to pay attention to your state government, because just about everything that you do is somehow impacted by state legislation. You know, whether your child's required to wear a helmet, what age they need to begin kindergarten at, whether or not you can walk at a crosswalk without having to have having a signal for the car to stop. Mm-hmm. Things of that nature, the speed limits, crime, everything is impacted by the state legislature. And they fortunately are really good people. They want to hear from their constituents about different policies and how they impact them. But a lot of people just don't know to make that call or send an email or submit comments at a public hearing.
Exactly. Now, this is the long legislative session this year, which means it's time to talk about the budget.
Right. It's pretty much all about the budget at this point. And so anything that has a fiscal note, and we have an Office of Fiscal Analysis that analyzes each bill, and if it has a fiscal impact on the state or the municipality, has to go to the Appropriations Committee. And so they end up killing a lot of the bills if they do have an impact that's not reflected in the budget. And so we'll see. Again, the budget's coming out next week. We'll see what it means in terms of municipal aid. But this year there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of that is caused by the potential for cuts on the federal level. There's been a lot of talk about cuts that may be coming in terms of Medicaid.
Right. And
we're heavily dependent on Medicaid dollars to fund very critical services. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out on the federal level. I know the Republicans on the state level are saying, wait a minute, there's been talk about cuts. We haven't seen any cuts yet.
Right.
So let's step back and see what's going on before we start to make some changes to the state's fiscal guardrails. And so I don't know, we haven't talked about that, but back in 2017, when the state was facing what OPM had described back then as a permanent fiscal crisis, and we were facing unfunded pension liabilities for state employees and teachers that were just millions and millions of dollars, they ended up coming to some agreement that in order to avoid the situation coming again in the future, that the state would enact these fiscal guardrails. And so once a certain level of funding was received or revenues was received, some of that had to go into the rainy day fund, some of that had to go to pay off the unfunded pension liabilities. And it's worked very well. It's positioned Connecticut very well coming out of COVID. We were one of the few states that was actually in good shape financially. But now they're saying, well, wait a minute, our budget surplus is getting so high.
Right.
Isn't it time to loosen those guardrails in case there is an emergency, like some cuts on the federal level? So that's been a big backdrop to this whole budget discussion this session.
Now, what are fiscal guardrails?
So they are basically mechanisms that are created to ensure that the legislature can't spend certain amounts of money, that it has to put some aside for the rainy day fund, it has to put some aside to pay unfunded pension liabilities. So it's a little complicated. There's a volatility cap, but it's, again, a budgeting mechanism to ensure conservative fiscal practices in the future.
Now, with the governor, with them talking about the budget, how's it looking for the state?
It's hard to say. Again, there's been a lot of volatility this session, this year, and so we'll see how it plays out. Again, legislators are pretty good about recognizing that if you cut municipal aid, it's basically putting a tax on property taxpayers.
Right.
But at the same time, if they are facing financial pressures, municipal aid is a big category of the budget. And so sometimes it's looked at like, well, maybe we can trim some dollars here. Hopeful that that's not going to happen. We'll know more next week.
Now, I see the cost is pushing for changes to the proposed budget to provide additional funding for towns for education and special education.
Right. So currently, under special education, the costs are just growing significantly. Right. There's some estimates that each year special educations go up 5 to 6% a year.
Okay.
And it's just really creating some hardships for towns. It's also a very unpredictable cost, particularly for a small town. If you have just 2 or 3 students that have very specialized needs that need to be put in different placements, either out of state, it can add just hundreds of thousands of dollars to the budget that you weren't anticipating. And so currently there's what they call an excess cost fund.
Okay.
And that provides towns with funding over 4.5 times the average cost of educating a student. Once you hit that threshold, then the state will reimburse you. But that means since the average cost, say it's around $20,000, you're spending a lot of money for one student before you even get any of that funding back. So it's just a challenge. And I think towns are really committed to meeting the needs of their special education students. They're just saying, the state has a responsibility to fund this. They knew going into the budget last year that they had not appropriated sufficient funding for special education. And so they're trying to make it right, but at the same time, they allocated an additional $40 million. I think they're projecting that the shortfall was more about $180 million. So
wow.
We have a ways to go.
From 40 million to 180.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
It's a pretty substantial piece of change.
Right. So we're trying to protect our property taxpayers because we know when the budget goes out and they get their tax bill, people are upset if it's going up a significant amount. The problem is the state also passes a number of property tax exemptions.
Okay.
Last year, for example, they passed a bill that would provide a tax exemption for veterans with permanent and total disabilities. But the way that they assumed that it would be applicable and the way that it ended up being applicable were very different. So instead of costing $4.9 million across the state, it's looking like it could be upwards of $25 million. So that means that those taxes that are not being paid by certain veterans are now being borne by other property taxpayers. So it's always a cost shift. They also changed the way that motor vehicles are assessed. Okay. And that ended up resulting in a big drop in grand lists for many towns. And towns weren't expecting it. And so they had to make up for that difference. So towns are facing some very difficult budget decisions. We keep reminding legislators that to the extent that they enact new exemptions, you're just shifting the burden to other homeowners and property taxpayers. Right. But this year, they're still considering eliminating the car tax, which nobody likes the car tax. It's considered a nuisance tax, but it does generate almost $1 billion of property tax revenue for our towns each year. And so if you're going to do that, you're going to end up having to provide that funding somewhere else. And what that means is it's going to be, again, borne by those homeowners and property taxpayers. So it's a big concern. I mean, sure, we'd like to get rid of the car tax, but unless you come up with $1 billion, we just can't have that conversation. And the state keeps saying, don't worry, we're going to reimburse you for those lost revenues. But whenever they face budget challenges, that kind of funding ends up disappearing.
Okay. You think the car tax, getting rid of it's going to happen this session? Or
no, I don't. I really don't. I just don't see how they can come up with $1 billion of revenue to reimburse towns. And I think they recognize that the homeowners, who are already paying a significant amount of property tax, are just going to end up paying more. So who's really going to win with that?
Exactly.
If you're a renter, your rent will probably go up because your landlord is paying more in property taxes.
Right.
If you have your own home, you're going to pay less for your car, but you're going to pay more for your home. So it's kind of a wash. So people need to be mindful of that when they enact legislation.
Exactly. And what other property tax issues do you want to touch on?
Well, the other issue, so there's been a proliferation of solar arrays throughout the state.
Okay.
And that's a good thing. We're trying to meet Connecticut's energy efficiency goals and reduce our carbon footprint. And certainly, I think towns have embraced solar. The issue comes up with regard to how do you tax these systems?
Right.
So the solar developers have proposed a uniform capacity tax, which would charge for and these are for grid scale solar, the big solar arrays, not the solar on your house or the solar in someone's backyard, but the big solar arrays, they would pay a per kilowatt fee. And the issue comes down to what should that fee be? And the solar developers want it to be low. We want it to be about $12,000 per kilowatt because the towns have figured out that that would be what they need to be made whole. But the solar developers are saying that's way too high. And then the other issue comes up is, well, shouldn't we increase that to keep up with inflation every year? So we would like to see an escalator clause built in so that that 12,000 base rate increases by a certain percentage every year. So I don't know if that's going to go anywhere this session, but that is one of the property tax issues under consideration. And there's probably about a dozen other property tax exemptions that are under consideration. All always sound good, but unfortunately, it just gets back down to that shifting the burden to others in your community.
Now let's talk. I guess there's a pilot program.
So the pilot, and actually, pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes.
Okay.
And so when the state enacted a pilot program, it was considered landmark legislation. And what it said was, if you have state-owned property, you have a state-owned building, like the state office building, the legislative office building. If you have private colleges or private hospitals in your community, we're not going to make them pay taxes.
Okay.
But recognizing that you're going to lose a lot of property tax revenue, what the state said they would do was give you a payment in lieu of taxes grant.
Okay.
And that would be a great idea, except that they've capped the grants. And so each year, there's certain amount of revenues that towns aren't receiving under that grant program. So they've tried to make changes. They now have recognized that if you're a town that has a significant amount of tax-exempt property, you should get a higher reimbursement rate. I guess that makes sense. But what it does is leave some of our smaller towns at the bottom of the barrel in terms of getting their payment in lieu of taxes funding. So fortunately, that doesn't appear to be cut in this budget, but it's always something that we pay attention to.
Okay. Would you mind sticking around for another segment?
Sure.
All right,
happy
we'll be right
to.
back.
No, you didn't win $1 million or that brand new car, but several people have notified Better Business Bureau that they've been contacted by someone posing as Publishers Clearinghouse, claiming they won but couldn't get their prize until they paid a fee to the IRS. Some say they were even shown a photo of their prize to make it look more real. Remember, you have to play to win. If you'd like to enter sweepstakes, keep track of them yourself so you can confirm what's legit and what isn't. Also, no legitimate sweepstakes will ask you to pay fees, shipping, or taxes. Report a scam to bbb.org/scam tracker.
Come on in, come on in.
Welcome to Sure Things.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show.
Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
Welcome back to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. I'm Pete Mezzetti, sitting here with Betsy Gara, who's the Executive Director of Cost. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice
Thank
to
you.
be here.
Thanks for sticking around. All right, so we're going to let's talk about affordable housing to open up this segment.
Sure. Well, affordable housing has been a big topic at the General Assembly for the last several years now. Okay. There's been task forces trying to identify solutions. There's been proposals from the Home Builders Association, from housing advocates, from the Connecticut Business and Industry Association. But not a lot has happened. So once again, there are proposals this year. One of the big ones, and we're not sure what is going to happen with it, is a proposal called Fair Share Housing. And it's based on a New Jersey model that requires each town to be assessed a specific housing allocation goal.
Okay.
And so what they did a couple years back was they directed the Office of Policy and Management to contract with a consultant to look at Connecticut's housing needs and determine what that fair share housing allocation should be for each and every town in the state. And they just finalized their methodology, and it's creating quite the stir. So we actually had a meeting earlier today with the regional councils of government, and those are bodies that look at a lot of different issues, but also include a lot of planners. So they focus a lot on planning activities. So they're experts at that. And one of the things that they pointed out was that this methodology is very flawed. And that's problematic because we're concerned that it's going to be used to determine what each town needs to do in terms of meeting their affordable housing goals.
Okay.
What the fair share methodology doesn't include, because it wasn't required to as part of the legislation, it doesn't include any consideration of whether a town has sufficient water capacity, sewer capacity, whether or not it has a lot of buildable area. There are towns, for example, that the land is subject to conservation easements because it's watershed land or because it's state forest land, like Voluntown. So you have a lot of differences in our communities as to how they can meet their affordable housing needs. It also doesn't focus a lot on what the demand is in a particular area.
Okay.
And so we're taking a look at that. The methodology was just released, but we're concerned that there is a bill that's been approved by the Housing Committee that would require towns to update their affordable housing plans. Towns were required to do that a few years ago and to update them every 5 years, but now it would require them to identify realistic opportunities for meeting those housing allocation goals. The big kicker is that there's a provision in the bill that would allow any interested party, so whether you or some organization or me, to end up suing the state or the municipality and saying, you failed to meet your fair share goal, and so we want to take you to court. So what is that going to do? It's really going to embroil the state and the municipalities in litigation, which costs a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And that's money that's going to be taken away from other critical programs like education and special education, public safety. And so we have a lot of concerns about that. Now, the study was just finalized recently. We have 6 weeks left to go in the legislative session.
Right.
They haven't had a hearing on the methodology. There is a requirement that the legislature has to approve it.
Right.
That was part of a compromise that the Republicans pushed for, but that hasn't happened yet. So we're a little nervous about the fact that this fair share methodology isn't well understood. And fortunately, the regional councils of government are ready to say, you know what, we can be an important resource here. We can explain to you why this is not the appropriate way to look at this issue, and maybe how you can do that better, so that we can actually have some movement in addressing affordable housing without burying municipalities under a ton of potential lawsuits and just bureaucratic red tape. So that's one issue on housing. Right. The other one is something they call transit-oriented communities. And this is a bill that would give certain towns a priority for funding, different funding streams, if they are eligible transit-oriented communities. And so to be eligible, you have to have a train or bus station, and you also have to agree to allow certain by right approvals of middle housing. So those 2, 3, 4 family housing stock, the cluster housing, they call the perfect 6, but you have to allow them as right. You don't have to build them, you just have to ensure that your zoning allows those. The concern that we have with that proposal is, one, that it gives priority for funding to towns that can be eligible as transit-oriented communities. There are a lot of small towns that may not be eligible. And the other is that it's very prescriptive. So what if you say, well, we have a train station, but that kind of housing probably wouldn't fit because either our roads are too narrow, or maybe there's bedrock, or there's a brownfield site there. Who knows? It could be anything. So why are you going to be so prescriptive? And then you look around and you see that towns are already doing this. So why are we getting in the way of this by adding a lot more requirements, a lot of hoops to jump through? You look at Old Saybrook. I mean, they've got some affordable housing near their train station. Essex. I see it happening in Madison. So it's happening throughout the state. Berlin is a good example of it as well. And it requires a very thoughtful process on the local level to get it right and to make sure that you're doing it in a way that meets the needs of your community, but also providing some affordable housing opportunities as part of that. So we're concerned that the bill just gets in the way and undermines all the good progress that towns have been making in that regard. And then there's another bill, not really affordable housing, but what it would do is require every town to establish a fair rent commission. And I know that you're familiar with fair rent commissions. So under existing law, towns with a population of 25,000 or more have to establish a fair rent commission. But there are bills pending this year that you may be interested in that actually would require certain procedures to be followed by the Fair Rent Commission. You've got to publish your bylaws online. You've got to adhere to certain notice requirements, kind of becoming more formal. Currently, it's supposed to be an informal, layperson type of commission. What they're moving to is something that's more quasi-judicial. And so to require every single town, regardless of how many rental units they have, just doesn't make a lot of sense. They also say, well, you could do it on a regional basis. Maybe the regional councils of government want to do it. Well, they don't want to do it. No. We've asked them. They're like, no, we don't want to do this. We'd have to hire attorneys. Attorneys are expensive. We have a lot of other things going on. So that's another issue that we're paying very close attention to. So again, affordable housing, we're not sure what's going to happen. The legislature always takes this approach. Instead of doing one bill, getting people together in a room and trying to figure out how to make it work. They end up with a dozen different bills, looking at it from every which way. And so you're not really sure what's going to emerge as a viable affordable housing bill. So it kind of leaves us off guard. And that's unfortunate because we're trying to help. We're trying to provide constructive input. We do support efforts to promote affordable housing in our communities, but want to make sure that it's done in a way that recognizes some of the limitations that our towns have.
Now, what is the Regional Council of Government?
So the regional councils of government, they actually replaced the regional planning agencies that were formed, I don't remember how long ago.
Okay.
But they were designed to assist municipalities in planning for the region and looking at the plans of conservation and development, looking at transportation. They receive a lot of federal transportation dollars, so how to share that to meet the regional transportation needs. They ended up being revamped into COGS, and I think it's been a really positive change. So in the past, the people that served on the regional planning agencies were pretty much the planners.
Right.
And that was good, but now we have the municipal leaders serving on the boards, and it's really created a mechanism for some good dialogue about how to approach issues on a regional basis,
Right.
whether it's affordable housing, whether it's transportation planning, you name it. They've been very good about leveraging their resources to provide some big value to our municipalities. So in this area, for example, you have River COG,
Yes.
which is chaired, the executive director is Sam Golden. He does a fabulous job of leading the COG in providing important services to towns on a regional basis. Things like the waste collection and hazardous waste and things like that. I know that they do a lot of that, but they're also very helpful in looking at permitting issues, providing towns with some opportunities to build on regional efficiencies to save money. It's all about saving money.
I believe before they had the River Cog, and I believe they had in Saybrook, was it Crepa?
That sounds familiar.
Or something
I didn't
on-
work with them a lot before they were COGs.
Yeah, before they were COG, because they were actually, the other regional planning agency was actually at the train station.
Oh,
So I know
okay.
exactly
Yeah,
where they were.
But they are a very valuable resource. I think our municipal leaders benefit tremendously from participating on their COG, and they work well together. So we don't have counties in Connecticut,
No.
but I know the COGs are considered a county equivalent for federal funding. So that's been a benefit as well.
Now, does every town and the state have a COG agency, or is it?
Yes, they do.
Yes, okay.
And the ones I attend very frequently, and they get great representation. So they're very well attended meetings, a lot of good dialogue, and a lot of information resources sharing.
I've actually never had Sam Gold on with me. What's he like?
Oh, he's great.
Is he?
Yeah, he's a very dynamic young man, knows his stuff, and he's been, a leader at the state level on issues of regionalism and improving efficiencies by sharing services.
Now, let's talk about climate resiliency.
Climate resiliency, that's another big topic of conversation. So last year, they had what you called the Green Monster Bill, and it was just this humongous kind of, when a bill ends up having multiple pieces,
Okay.
they call it an aircraft carrier. Well, this one became known as the Green Monster, and it was very much tied to reducing emissions.
Okay.
And it ended up getting bogged down and never passed. So this year, there were 3 proposals, one from the governor's office, which was almost identical, if not completely identical, to the one that the Senate Democrats put forward, Senate Bill 9, and then the House Democrats also have their proposal. The proposal is focused predominantly on looking at those plans of conservation and development. So the state does a state plan, the COGs do they do their regional plans, and the municipalities do their own plans of conservation and development. They have to update them every 10 years or they're at risk of losing funding. And it's an important exercise. So as towns update their plans, you may see notices in the paper or on the radio or on cable TV asking for input, asking for people to be involved. And it identifies those areas in a town that must be conserved, those areas that are a good area in order to build, maybe issues that they need to address in terms of protection of natural resources, things of that nature. So the climate resiliency proposals are going to require towns to look at how are they going to plan for these increased precipitation, all the storm events, the rising sea levels, the flooding that you see now more so than you used to see. How are they going to account for that in their plan? Because if you don't plan for it, you're going to be affected by it.
Right.
You're going to see your infrastructure flooded. You're going to see certain sewage problems because of that, septic tanks. You need to begin to plan for it. And I think towns are doing a great job. I know down at the shore you do see meetings where they're updating their coastal resiliency plans. They're trying to address some of the flooding that's been occurring. They're hardening their infrastructure to make sure that it's not susceptible to power outages and storm events and whatnot. So this is basically a planning bill. There is a piece of the bill that will allow towns to do what they call resiliency improvement districts. Because some of this stuff is expensive. So if you're looking at an area and you need to raise a road, for example, because it continues to flood, you have a lot of homes on the shoreline here. This would allow you to do that through a financing mechanism, and that way you can afford to do some of those improvements that are necessary. So I think some towns will find that valuable. I know the town of Brantford, for example, has been very forward-thinking in terms of its climate resiliency initiatives. And so I think that they have been helpful in trying to provide information to other towns on how to do that. So it's going to be a big topic, something to pay attention to, certainly.
And with this little time left in the session, do you think it's going to go anywhere?
I think that it is a priority. So, and when something has been identified by both the governor's office and Senate Democrats as a priority, it has a very good shot of passing. I can't remember if it went through one chamber last year or not, but I think the home builders had a lot of concerns about changes to the state building code that were incorporated in the bill. Those were dropped. So I think it does have a good chance of passage. It is going to mean more work for towns, but from what I've heard from some of our folks that are involved in those plans of conservation and development, towns are already beginning to do that. This will provide them with some additional resources and expertise to identify ways that they can ensure the safety of their residents by addressing climate resiliency.
Now, what are cost positions on the bills and how they would affect small towns?
So we always look through the bills and determine whether or not they would have a specific impact on small towns. And there are some where you could tell that a lot of the legislators are not from a small, particularly a rural community, and they just don't understand kind of how something may impact a small town. The affordable housing is a case in point, where they say, well, every town's got to meet this, say it's a 10% affordable housing threshold. And they're saying, well, there's no way we're going to be able to do that, first of all, because we don't have sewer. And they say, well, then you should just get sewer. Well, you can't get sewer because EPA says that you're in a sewer avoidance area because we don't want you to pollute some of these tidal rivers or the Long Island Sound or wherever you happen to be in the state. And as a result, it's not like you can just do that. It's
Right.
also expensive. If you want to try to extend a water main or install sewers, extremely expensive.
Right.
And so that's why we have to make sure that they understand that. It's not as easy as just saying, yes, build affordable housing, you could put it there. We have towns that are struggling with wastewater capacity, can't support some of the businesses that are already in their community, and so they have to understand that. Same thing with, there was a bill on regionalization of schools, and they were saying, you need to consolidate your schools, you're going to save money. Well, we were looking at the Northwest Hills
Right.
and in that part of the state, and if you were going to regionalize the schools, you were going to have kids on a bus for an hour and a half going each way,
Right.
and that would have ended up adding tremendously to the cost of education because buses don't come cheap.
No.
And so it just really didn't work. It didn't work in terms of cost. It certainly didn't work in terms of the quality of education. So we do need to point those things out. That's why we encourage our municipal leaders to meet regularly with their legislative delegation, regardless if they're from the same party or not. I think by and large, our municipal leaders have great relationships with their legislative delegations. They certainly listen to them.
Right.
And so we just have to, what cost does is when we know that there's going to be a debate on the budget or the negotiations are underway on the budget or a particular bill, that's when we'll send out a call to action to our towns to say, you know what, pick up the phone, call your legislators, just remind them, what you're looking at in terms of a budget, some of the issues that you're facing, and they'll help. And so that we just need to make sure that communication happens on a regular basis throughout the legislative session.
And how about legislative advocacy?
Right. Well, it's part of that. I mean, that we are a grassroots advocacy organization, meaning we rely on our members to contact their legislators to talk about how these issues are going to affect them. Again, they can put a local spin on how an issue is going to impact them. It's one thing for me to say, well, transit-oriented development wouldn't be appropriate here, but it's another thing for them to say, walk down this street. We're in a village, our train station's in a village district. There is no way that you can actually build that here, and this is why. So they need to get that, we need those boots on the ground from our municipal leaders to let them know, let legislators know how something is going to impact them. And so again, we issue regular calls to action. We, prior to COVID, had a lot more meetings up at the Capitol. It's been hard to get people up and out at the Capitol, but it's very easy to testify. So testify probably sounds too formal. People get a little intimidated by, what do you mean you come up to testify? But what it is really providing comments.
Right.
They give you 3 minutes. You can even just click on a link, submit comments on a bill. It could be 2 or 3 sentences. But it's easy to provide that kind of information to legislators on how a bill may impact you. And so that's why we promote advocacy. We encourage our residents also to call their legislators if they're concerned with how a bill affects their community.
And I'm sure you can always testify via Zoom or...
Right. Well, that's one of the benefits, I suppose, that has emerged from COVID, unfortunately, is that Zoom allows you to testify, provide comments on a particular bill, follow the legislative process on YouTube or Zoom, or even on CTN, the Connecticut network, which is a very valuable resource.
It is.
So it's easier than ever to stay in touch with what's happening. A lot of municipalities are continuing to hold their meetings either on cable or by Zoom or hybrid meetings.
Yeah.
So again, easier than ever to stay engaged and provide input on what's happening in your community.
And one thing we have to mention, how close do you guys work with CCM?
We work very closely with CCM. I was just on a call before this interview with Brian O'Connor from CCM.
And Joe?
No, Joe wasn't there,
Oh,
but
Joe was-
Brian was there, and Zachary McCune, I don't know if you know him.
I don't know Zach.
From CCM, and all the COG representatives.
Ah.
And we were discussing the fair share housing methodology and trying to get a handle on what some of the issues were with that, some of the concerns. One of the concerns is that it's not even being reported entirely accurately in the press because it's a complicated issue.
Well, let's talk about it. We got time, so.
Well, I
Briefly.
briefly I could probably do that. It's
All right.
so, for example,
Yes.
one of the COGs analyzed the housing needs data.
All right.
The fair share methodology indicates that Connecticut would have to build 124,000 additional units of affordable housing
All right.
to meet the current housing needs. They don't provide any kind of time frame, whether that's 10 years out, 20 years out. But when the COG analyzed it, they said it's really not. It's probably more like 36,000. Well,
Okay.
that's a big difference.
Yeah.
And so we need to get a handle on kind of how they came up with their numbers and what they're looking at, so that this methodology doesn't all of a sudden show up in a piece of legislation,
Right.
and our towns are going to be scrambling to figure out how on earth they're going to be able to do that. And at the same time, based on that particular legislation, it opens them up to a lawsuit if somebody doesn't feel that they're doing their fair share. So we pay a lot of attention to that.
Now, you mentioned in the first segment that there's something up at the legislature regarding the Fair Rent Commission.
Yes, so there's a bill that would require each and every town, so the smallest town, which is the town of Union, which has about, I think, 900 people in town. I think, according to Zillow, they had one rental unit in their town. But they would be required to establish a fair rent commission.
Okay.
And the issue is, it's one thing when these commissions are considered informal, an informal process, not a judicial type of process. But there are pending bills that would make them into more of a quasi-judicial process, meaning you're going to need attorneys. You're going to have a more formal process.
Right.
And so it's going to be difficult for smaller towns to staff those kinds of fair rent commissions that may not be utilized. You may establish it by ordinance. You may have people appointed. You may even retain legal counsel. And then if nobody files a complaint, you've gone through that whole process for nothing. The bill does allow you to work with your neighboring communities or
Right.
your COGs, your regional councils of government, to do that on a regional basis.
Right.
But from what I understand, the regional councils of government, which are focused on planning and transportation and other things, aren't that interested in doing it.
No.
So I think if the state is interested in having fair rent commissions,
Right.
it should establish them and it should staff them. And then I think you could have some consistency across the state.
Right.
Because some towns have been sued. At least one town, the Fair Rent Commission has been sued by the landlord because the landlord disagreed with the decision.
Right.
And so, that's going to increase costs for the town, and that means increase in property tax
Oh,
levels.
absolutely. And I know some fair rent commissions only meet on a as-needed basis.
Right. And it's difficult. It's hard to find people to staff things like that. When you say, would you like to serve on the Fair Rent Commission? We don't know when or if we're going to meet, because that's usually the first question. How often do you meet? What's the time commitment? Well, we don't know.
Right.
We may end up with a slew of complaints one week, and then all of a
Exactly.
sudden we're meeting. So difficult.
It is.
Right.
You think it's going to pass or?
Well, it's included in Senate Bill 12, which is one of the Senate Democrats' top priorities.
Okay.
So it could very likely pass.
Pass both the House and the Senate, or?
It could, yes.
could?
And that is one thing we would consider an unfunded mandate. We talk a lot about unfunded mandates, things the state mandates that the towns do, but they don't give them any money to do it, and they don't give the town any flexibility. So it's a problem.
And now if people want more information on cost, where can they go?
They can go to our website, ctcost.org.
Okay.
They can also find us on LinkedIn. We're also on X, although I've kind of stopped using that a lot.
Me too.
So, yeah, and we're happy to speak with folks about any of the issues that they feel are important for their small town.
All right, Betsy Gar from Cost. We're about to run out of time. Thanks for coming down. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
Oh, yeah, great. Thanks, Pete. Nice to be down here.
On behalf of Betsy Gar, I'm Pete Mezzetti. Thanks, good night, and we'll see you next week. The preceding program was brought to you in part by the Cuckoo's Nest, which is located in Old Saybrook, Connecticut.